In 1987, Kawasaki released a motorcycle that committed corporate suicide. No cutting-edge technology, no racing pedigree, no innovation that would impress engineers or win magazine shootouts. Just a basic 650cc single-cylinder engine wrapped in utilitarian bodywork that looked like it was designed by accountants, not dreamers. The KLR650 was so boring that it became bulletproof. And for 31 years, that simplicity was a direct threat to an industry that needed you to buy a new motorcycle every few years. This is the story of how one bike refused to evolve and why the modern world eventually killed it for that sin. By 1987, the motorcycle industry had perfected the art of planned obsolescence. Every manufacturer released new models annually with incremental improvements designed to make last year's bike feel obsolete. Better suspension, more horsepower, sharper styling. The game wasn't about building perfect motorcycles, it was about building motorcycles that needed replacing. Kawasaki understood this game perfectly, and they played it with their sports bike and cruisers like everyone else. But when they released the KLR650, they violated every rule of modern manufacturing. They had built something that didn't need improvement. The numbers told a story of deliberate mediocrity. The 652cc liquid-cooled DOHC single-cylinder engine produced just 37 to 45 horsepower depending on who was measuring. By comparison, sports bikes of the era were pushing 100 horsepower from similar displacement. The KLR weighed over 400 pounds wet, making it a lumbering giant compared to lighter dual sports. It had a simple CVK-40 carburetor when fuel injection was already becoming standard. Its suspension was basic, its brakes were adequate at best, and its styling looked like someone had traced a generic motorcycle from a patent filing. But here's what the spec sheets couldn't measure. The KLR650 started every single time you pressed the button. It ran on terrible fuel. It could be repaired with basic hand tools in the middle of nowhere. It had a massive 6.1 gallon fuel tank that gave it over 200 miles of range. And most importantly, it cost thousands less than any comparable adventure motorcycle while doing 80% of what they could do. This wasn't mediocrity. This was weaponized simplicity. The industry watched with growing alarm as the KLR refused to die. Premium adventure bikes like BMW's RG1150 GS cost over $15,000 in the early 2000s, loaded with sophisticated electronics, shaft drives, and complex systems that required dealer service. The KLR650 sold for around $5,500 with a simple chain drive and a maintenance schedule so basic that owners routinely performed their own service in their driveways. BMW riders had heated grips and ABS. KLR riders had duct tape and zip ties, and they were riding the same trails, crossing the same continents, surviving the same conditions. This created an existential crisis for manufacturers who had invested millions convincing riders they needed sophisticated machinery. If a $5,500 motorcycle with technology from the 1980s could cross Africa, what justified spending $15,000 on a bike with computer-controlled suspension and GPS navigation? The KLR650's greatest sin wasn't being slow or ugly, it was proving that expensive was optional. The first generation KLR650 ran from 1987 to 2007 with almost no changes. 20 years, 2 decades during which Kawasaki released dozens of updated sports bikes, cruisers, and smaller displacement models. But the KLR? Nothing. Same carburetor, same suspension, same styling, same everything. This wasn't neglect, this was a statement. The bike worked, so Kawasaki left it alone. But working wasn't enough to avoid scrutiny. The KLR650 had a fatal flaw that every owner knew about, and Kawasaki refused to fix it for 20 years. The doohickey. This ridiculous name masked a serious problem. The engine's balancer chain tensioner used a spring-loaded lever that could fail catastrophically, allowing the chain to come loose and destroy the engine from inside. It was a $30 part that could cause $2,000 worth of damage. The aftermarket sold what Kawasaki wouldn't. Eagle Manufacturing developed a heavy-duty replacement doohickey that KLR owners installed as preventative maintenance. Online forums documented the procedure with detailed photos and instructions. The KLR community became self-sufficient because they had to be. Kawasaki had abandoned active development, so riders became their own engineers. This wasn't a weakness, it was training for what made the KLR special. Riders who could replace their own doohickeys could fix almost anything. In 2008, Kawasaki finally released an updated KLR650. The Gen 2 featured new bodywork, fuel injection, just kidding, it still had a carburetor. They added a few cosmetic changes, a larger windscreen, and slightly revised bodywork. That was it. The engine remained virtually unchanged. The message was clear: if it's not broken, we're not fixing it. The motorcycle press was appalled. but riders only shrugged and kept buying them. Reality was closing in, though. Environmental regulations in Europe had already made the carbureted KLR650 illegal to sell. The bike couldn't pass Euro emission standards, cutting off an entire continent of potential customers. In the United States, manufacturers faced increasing pressure to adopt cleaner technology. The KLR simple carburetor was becoming a liability in a world demanding catalytic converters and oxygen sensors. Then came the military validation that should have guaranteed the KLR's future. Hayes Diversified Technologies developed the M1030M1, a diesel-powered version of the KLR650 specifically for the US Marine Corps. Only 400 units were fielded. The military chose to modify a civilian budget motorcycle rather than develop purpose-built tactical bikes. This was the ultimate endorsement. The Marines trusted the KLR's fundamental design enough to bet soldiers' lives on it, but by 2018, the game was over. Kawasaki quietly discontinued the KLR650. No dramatic announcement, no farewell edition. After 31 years and hundreds of thousands of units sold, production simply stopped. The official reason was never stated, but everyone knew. The carbureted engine couldn't meet increasing strict emissions regulations, and developing a fuel-injected version for a niche product wasn't financially justified. The motorcycle industry had finally killed the bike that refused to die. The response was unexpected. Riders who had never owned KLR650s mourned its passing. Online forums exploded with stories of epic journeys, impossible repairs, and adventures that shouldn't have been possible on a budget motorcycle. The KLR had become more than a bike. It was proof that adventure didn't require unlimited budgets. Its death felt like the industry declaring that simplicity was no longer acceptable. For 3 years, the KLR650 was dead. Premium adventure bikes with $20,000 price tags filled the gap, loaded with TFT displays, electronic rider aids, and complex systems that required dealer software to diagnose. The market moved towards sophistication, just as manufacturers always wanted, but something was missing. The entry point was gone. In 2022, Kawasaki shocked everyone by bringing the KLR650 back. The Gen 3 finally featured fuel injection and ABS, but look closer at what they didn't change. The same basic 652cc single-cylinder engine, the same steel frame, the same utilitarian styling. Even with modern updates, the 2022 KLR650 started at $6,699, thousands less than any comparable adventure bike. Kawasaki had learned that you can force a bike to meet regulations, but you can't force riders to forget what made it special. But here's the truth they won't tell you. The 2022 KLR650 isn't sold in Europe. Even with fuel injection, it still doesn't meet Euro 5 emission standards. The bike that survived 31 years of production only came back because the American market has looser regulations than the rest of the world. The KLR650 exists in 2025 because the United States has become the place where old motorcycles go to die slowly. The KLR650's legacy reveals an uncomfortable truth about modern manufacturing. The motorcycle industry doesn't want bikes that last 31 years virtually unchanged. They need riders to chase the next upgrade, the next improvement, the next must-have technology. A motorcycle that works perfectly for decades is a financial disaster for companies that depend on repeat customers. Think about what the KLR proved. A bike designed in the 1980s with a simple carburetor outperformed machines costing 3 times as much in real-world conditions. Riders crossed continents on KLR650s while BMW GS owners sat in dealerships waiting for proprietary diagnostic equipment. The bike that should have been obsolete by 1995 was still selling strong in 2018. This terrified manufacturers more than any competitor. The doohickey problem was never really fixed by Kawasaki, even in the Gen 3. They improved it, but the fundamental design remains. Why? Because fixing it completely would require redesigning the engine, which defeats the entire purpose of the KLR650. The bike exists because it's simple enough to be reliable and cheap enough to be accessible. Perfect is the enemy of good enough, and Kawasaki understood that the KLR was already good enough in 1987. Here's the question that should terrify every motorcycle manufacturer. If a bike designed in 1987 is still competitive in 2025 with only minimal updates, what does this say about the thousands of dollars of improvements they've been selling for decades? Were electronic suspensions, TFT displays, and riding modes actually necessary? Or were they just ways to justify higher prices and force upgrades? The KLR650 proved that for most riders, most of the time, simple works better than sophisticated, but simplicity doesn't generate profit. It doesn't create dependency on dealer service. It doesn't drive upgrade cycles. The KLR had to be killed not because it failed, but but because it succeeded too completely at being exactly what it was. The bike's survival in 2025 is a compromise. It has fuel injection now, so it's not quite as simple. It has ABS, so it's not quite as cheap. Every generation gets slightly more complex, slowly transforming into the kind of bike it was supposed to be an alternative to. Give it another decade, and the KLR650 will probably cost $10,000 with a full suite of electronic rider aids that make it indistinguishable from every other adventure bike. But for now, the KLR650 remains the last bike standing from an era when motorcycles were tools, not platforms for software updates. You can still buy one new, you can still fix it with basic tools, you can still ride it anywhere on Earth without worrying about finding a dealer with diagnostic computers. That's not nostalgia, that's resistance against an industry that has decided simplicity is obsolete. But the KLR650's real story isn't told in manufacturer press releases or industry analysis. It's written in tire tracks across 6 continents and told by riders who bet their lives on Kawasaki's refusal to innovate. These stories reveal why the bike became legendary and why that legend threatened everything the motorcycle industry believed about itself. Dr. Gregory Fraser accomplished something that sounds like a lie. He rode over 1 million miles across multiple solo circumnavigations of the globe, not on a state-of-the-art adventure bike with satellite navigation and electronic suspension, on a 2001 KLR650, the same bike that motorcycle journalists dismissed as outdated and underpowered, became Fraser's tool for rewriting what was possible on 2 wheels. His 2001 KLR650 now sits in the National Motorcycle Museum in Anamosa, Iowa, not as a curiosity, but as proof. Every scratch, every dent, every zip-tied repair tells the story of a machine that survived conditions that would destroy bikes costing 4 times as much. Fraser didn't choose the KLR because he couldn't afford better. He chose it because better bikes failed in the real world, where parts availability mattered more than horsepower, and simplicity beat sophistication. Think about what this means. 1 million miles. That's equivalent to riding to the moon and back twice. On a bike that costs less than a used Honda Accord, the KLR didn't just survive Fraser's journeys, it enabled them. In remote regions where the nearest Kawasaki dealer might be thousands of miles away, the KLR's simple design meant local mechanics could improvise repairs with basic tools and universal parts. This wasn't a marketing claim, this was survival engineering proven across decades of extreme use. The KLR650 created an entire shadow economy that existed parallel to official manufacturer support. Companies like Eagle Manufacturing built businesses entirely around fixing Kawasaki's deliberate neglect. The doohickey problem should have been a public relations disaster. Instead, it became the foundation for an aftermarket industry that proved riders didn't need manufacturer support when the community provided better solutions. Eagle Mike's heavy-duty doohickey replacement became more trusted than Kawasaki's original part. Think about the implications. Customers were paying aftermarket companies to fix problems that the manufacturer refused to address, and they were grateful for the opportunity. This should have been humiliating for Kawasaki. Instead, it became part of the KLR's legend. The bike had a fatal flaw everyone knew about, and everyone fixed themselves, creating a shared ritual that bonded the community. The aftermarket ecosystem revealed something uncomfortable about modern manufacturing. KLR riders became more loyal to third-party companies that solved real problems than to Kawasaki, which created those problems through neglect. Online forums documented every modification, every upgrade, every improvement that Kawasaki should have engineered from the factory. The community became its own research and development department, sharing knowledge that collectively exceeded anything Kawasaki's corporate engineers had developed. This created a bizarre economic inversion. Kawasaki profited from selling a deliberately flawed product, while aftermarket companies profited from fixing those flaws. Both entities thrived, but only one earned rider loyalty. When Kawasaki finally discontinued the KLR650 in 2018, the outcry came not from corporate headquarters, but from riders who had built an entire culture around maintaining and modifying a bike the manufacturer had abandoned. The military's adoption of the KLR650 exposes an embarrassing truth about defense procurement. The United States military, with access to unlimited budgets and every motorcycle manufacturer on Earth begging for contracts, chose to modify a civilian budget motorcycle rather than commission purpose-built military machines. This wasn't a temporary experiment. Over 400 M1030 M1 diesel-powered KLR650s were fielded to the Marine Corps, seeing active deployment in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. Hayes Diversified Technologies transformed the KLR650's gasoline engine to run on GP8 jet fuel, the standard military diesel that powers everything from tanks to generators. The modification required extensive engineering. but it was deemed more practical than developing new motorcycles from scratch. The military understood what the civilian market was learning. The KLR650's fundamental design was sound enough that modifying it made more sense than replacing it. Combat deployment validated what adventure bikes already knew. The KLR650 worked when sophisticated machinery failed. In desert conditions where temperatures exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit and sand infiltrated everything, the KLR's simple design kept running. When electronic fuel injection systems failed due to dust contamination, carbureted KLR650s kept operating. When complex military-spec motorcycles required depot-level maintenance, KLR650s were field repaired with basic tools. This military validation should have transformed civilian perceptions of the KLR650. Instead, it was largely ignored by motorcycle media obsessed with covering the latest premium adventure bikes with fancy electronics. The message was clear. Proving your reliability in combat was less important than having the right brand prestige and cutting-edge features that looked good in magazine photo shoots. The KLR650 community developed its own culture that functioned independently of official manufacturer support. Online forums became technical reference libraries documenting every modification, every common failure, every workaround for problems Kawasaki refused to fix. The collective knowledge exceeded anything available in official service manuals. New KLR owners didn't turn to dealerships for advice. They turned to riders who had already solved every problem through trial, error, and shared experience. This community self-sufficiently represented an existential threat to manufacturer business models built on proprietary knowledge and dealer dependency. Modern motorcycles increasingly require specialized diagnostic equipment and dealer software to service. The KLR required a socket set and determination. This wasn't just about saving money on service. It was about maintaining ownership of your machine instead of licensing its use from a manufacturer that controlled all technical information. The economic impact of the KLR650's existence was profound and largely unacknowledged. By offering 80% of premium adventure bike capability at 30% of the cost, the KLR created market pressure that manufacturers desperately wanted to eliminate. Every rider who bought a KLR650 instead of a BMW R1150 GS represented $10,000 in lost revenue. Multiply that across thousands of units annually, and the KLR wasn't just competition, it was a direct challenge to the profit margins that sustained premium brands. This explains the collective relief when emissions regulations finally killed the carbureted KLR650 in 2018. The bike hadn't failed in the market. It had been assassinated by environmental laws that premium manufacturers could afford to meet, but that made the KLR's budget-friendly simplicity impossible to maintain. The regulatory landscape had been transformed into a weapon that eliminated competition disguised as environmental progress. The technical reasons why the KLR650 worked reveal uncomfortable truths about motorcycle engineering. The bike succeeded not despite its outdated technology, but because of it. The simple carburetor required no sensors, no computers, no software. It worked at any altitude, in any temperature, with any quality of fuel. Modern fuel injection is objectively superior in controlled conditions, but controlled conditions don't exist in the real world where the KLR spent its life. The engine's basic design meant worn-out parts could be replaced rather than entire assemblies discarded. When a modern bike's electronic fuel injection system fails, the entire unit often requires replacement at dealer pricing. When a KLR's carburetor developed problems, riders cleaned it with basic solvents and replaced jets that cost dollars instead of hundreds. This serviceability wasn't an accident, it was the consequence of designing for function over sophistication. The steel frame that motorcycle journalists criticized as heavy and outdated was actually brilliant engineering for real-world use. Steel can be welded anywhere by anyone with basic equipment. Aluminum requires specialized welding techniques and often can't be repaired in the field. In remote locations where the nearest aluminum welder might be thousands of miles away, steel frames meant catastrophic damage could be fixed by any competent local fabricator. This wasn't primitive engineering. This was strategic design for global deployment. The KLR650 suspension was constantly criticized as inadequate by motorcycle media, comparing it to premium bikes in controlled testing. But real-world riders reported different experiences. The simple suspension worked predictably, wore slowly, and could be maintained without specialized tools. Progressive springs and basic damping adjustments transformed the shock suspension into something genuinely capable. These improvements cost hundreds instead of thousands and could be performed by owners instead of dealers. This revealed another industry lie. Motorcycles don't need to be perfect from factory. They need to be good enough to be improved by their owners. The KLR650 was a platform that welcomed modification rather than a sealed system that punished anyone who dared violate manufacturer specifications. The philosophy directly contradicted modern manufacturing trends towards proprietary systems and dealer dependency. The bike's fuel capacity exposed another manufacturer deception. 6.1 gallons gave the KLR650 over 200 miles of range with conservative riding. Premium adventure bikes with smaller tanks and thirstier engines required more frequent stops, diminishing their theoretical performance advantages. Range isn't just about fuel capacity, it's about freedom from infrastructure dependency. The KLR could reach places where gas stations didn't exist and return safely. That capability was worth more than any electronic suspension or GPS navigation system. When Kawasaki brought the KLR650 back in 2022, they revealed their own uncertainty about what made the bike special. The new version included fuel injection and ABS, necessary concessions to regulatory reality, but they maintained the basic engine architecture, the steel frame, and the utilitarian styling. Kawasaki understood that the KLR's essence couldn't be modernized without destroying what made it valuable. This created an impossible tension. How do you update a bike whose value comes from refusing to change? The 2022 KLR650 exists in a strange limbo. It's modern enough to meet current regulations, but simple enough to maintain some connection to its heritage. Starting at $6,699, it remains thousands cheaper than premium alternatives, but it's no longer the time capsule that survived unchanged for 20 years. Every electronic system added is another potential failure point. Every sensor is another component that requires diagnostic equipment to troubleshoot. The bike is becoming what it was supposed to be an alternative to. The KLR650 story asks a question that manufacturers desperately want ignored. If a bike designed in 1987 remains competitive in 2025, what value did 3 decades of innovation actually provide? Were riders really better served by bikes with TFT displays and electronic suspension? Or were those features primarily about justifying higher prices and forcing upgrade cycles? The industry's inability to improve on the KLR's fundamental formula for nearly 40 years suggests that modern motorcycle development serves corporate interests rather than rider needs. So here's the real question. Do you think manufacturers discontinued bikes like the KLR650 because they couldn't meet emission standards? Or because they prove that riders don't actually need everything the industry is trying to sell them? Let us hear what you think in the comments section. And if you want to see more videos like this, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.